So thank you all for inviting us today. My name is Irene Aue-Bendavid, and I'm the director of the Lübeck Institute Jerusalem. I'm happy to welcome all of you on behalf of the International LBI. By using the new digital possibilities, we organized this evening in Jerusalem as a joint event of the Lübeck Institutes in London, New York, and Jerusalem. And we are coming together today to celebrate and to discuss the latest publication of Michael Brennner, his book In Hitler's Munich, Jews, the Revolution and the Rise of Nazism, which was recently published by Princeton University Press. In his book, Brennner is focusing on the early years of the Weimar Republic after Germany lost World War I, the failed revolution from 1918-19, and he's taking us to this through the German city where Hitler established the Nazi movement with his anti-Semitic ideas. And Brennner shows the various ways that the Jews in Munich reacted to these attacks. Miriam Zadov called the book recently a real thriller about the Bavarian Revolution. And I'm really happy that you are all with us today. This event is on the Zoom webinar and also accessible through Facebook Live. Princeton University Press offers you a discount on the book. So if you haven't bought it, if you didn't buy it yet, if you want to buy it, you can go to the website of Princeton University Press, and my colleague Yael, she will put in the chat the discount code that you need to enter. There is a 30% reduction of the book until the end of July. With us here this evening are the author, Professor Michael Brennner, who is with us in Washington, and Professor Stephen Eschheim here with me from Jerusalem. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to write them in the chat or in the comment section on Facebook. We will give space for this discussion at the end of the panel. And just for your orientation, the event will last approximately an hour or an hour and 15 minutes, something like that. Let me briefly introduce to you our two speakers tonight, although I know that this is probably not necessary to introduce them to them. With us is Michael Brennner, as I said. He's a Seymour and Lillian Adelson Chair in Israel Studies and Director of the Center for Israel Studies at the American University in Washington. He also holds the Chair of Jewish History and Culture at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, and he serves as the International President of the Lübeck Institute. He's the first recipient of the newly established Salo and Jeanette Baron Award for Scholarly Excellence in Research on the Jewish Experience. And I just want to mention some of his publications. He published widely on Jewish historiography, Zionist history, German Jewry during the Weimar Republic. Most of you might know his book, The Renaissance of Jewish Culture in Weimar Germany, that came out in 1996. He published on Jewish Munich, Jüdisches München in German in 2006. And he was one of the co-editors of the full volume German Jewish History in Modern Times that came out in 97-98. Our second speaker is tonight Professor Stephen Eschheim. He's an emeritus professor of history at the Hebrew University, Jerusalem, where he taught cultural and intellectual history in the Department of History. And he also acted there as a director of the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center for German Literature and Cultural History. Professor Eschheim has been teaching in various universities all over the globe. And from his many publications, I would like to mention only some of them. He's the author of Brothers and Strangers, the East European Jew in German and German Jewish Consciousness from 1800 to 1923. That book is from 1982. Culture and Catastrophe, German and Jewish Confrontations with National Socialism and Other Crises from 1996. And his latest publication, In Fragile Spaces, Forays into Jewish Memory, European History and Complex Identities, which appeared in 2018. Steve, I'd like to invite you to start the evening.
Good. So good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I hope everyone else is too. I'm also particularly interested in participating in this evening. By the way, there are not two speakers. There's one speaker. His name is Michael Brennner. I am merely the conversant and will occasionally intersperse a comment. But I am really delighted because for many years, I've known about Jewish revolutionaries, both of the interesting and good kind, if I may put it this way, and of the rather more problematic kind. I think what Michael has done has finally written a book, the kind of book that needs to be written. But instead of me telling you I'm going to ask Michael, first of all, what brought about you to write the book? What motivated it? And could you give us some kind of idea, certainly not of the whole book, but of the major theses that you want to convey to a broader audience?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you, Irene, and thank you to all three Leo Baeck Institutes for arranging it. And it's really, as always, a real pleasure talking with you, Steve. And thank you for doing this. So it goes really back a long time. Since you asked me when I conceived the book, it was a very long birth. In fact, I wanted to write my master's thesis. I'm afraid it is about 35 years ago. It was with the late Michael, who was a professor at the Hebrew University, I'm sure known to many who are listening. In the end, I didn't. I wrote about something else. But I realized 30 years later or 25 years later, when I started again thinking about it, that this book has not been written. And I'm talking now about the Jewish revolutionaries in Munich, 1918-19. It has not been written. And I also realized that the 100th anniversary of the revolution was approaching. And everybody in Munich seemed to be very excited about the revolution suddenly, 100 years later. And in fact, when it came in 1918-19, it was unbelievable. Every night there were at least 5 or 6 events in Munich somehow commemorating the revolution of 1918-19 for about half a year. So I managed to get the book out almost in time, at least for the end of the revolutionary events in early 2019 in German and now in English. And since you asked what makes it different from what makes this revolution different from other revolution, it's not only on Pesach that we might ask the question, but in terms of Jewish history, I think it was quite different. First of all, I would say that the participation of Jews was more pronounced than in any other, even though there were many Jewish revolutionaries of course, in Russia, in Hungary, and that might come close, and also some in Berlin. But you really have almost all of the leading revolutionaries in Munich being Jewish. And the second part related to it is that these are actually, of course, they're all different, but many of them are not only aware of them being Jewish, but they somehow deal with this openly and don't hide it. And some of them are very conscious Jews, I should say, not of course in religious terms, but in their own identity. And we can talk maybe more about this in a minute. And then the second part, of course, and that's the second part of the book, is the rise of anti-Semitism and so on. So of course, obviously, what made it special is that there was one person witnessing at the time, whose name was Adolf Hitler, who at least later claimed that this was a decisive event in him becoming a politician. We don't know if that's true, because he said that he wrote this in Mein Kampf a few years later. But certainly Hitler was in town for most of the revolutionary events in Munich, which lasted until early May 1919.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just respond to one or two of your comments. And that is the amazing fact that you relate that in 2018, there were massive celebrations and all kinds of reveling about the Munich revolutions. But from what I gather from your book and from other sources, this was not exactly a revolution that was greeted with great enthusiasm by the Munich population. That is to say, certainly not by the conservatives, not by the bourgeoisie. As you point out, many, and we'll get to this, many of the Jewish communities were deeply worried about the activities of the revolutionaries. So in a way, you are witnessing a century of massive swing of sensibility. Whether or not Jewish revolutionaries today had to rise up in Munich or in Berkeley or in Washington or in Charlottesville, it's another question. So that would be my first comment, and I hope you'll answer that. The second thing that I wanted you perhaps to speak about, because it is another unique aspect of your work. I've never seen this done, and it should be done by Jewish historians. That is to say, you describe each chapter or each event that occurs by relating it to the particular Jewish holiday that occurred as these events transpired, which gives the work, if you like, an added Jewish element. My third comment here, and then the floor is yours again. There's no doubt about it that what you have done is a significant contribution to the problem of the writing about Jews and revolution, because here you are showing that indeed these were Jews who did not simply deny their Jewishness, they were not simply disavowing their Jewishness, but indeed, in some cases, openly admitted, even celebrated it. You give these wonderful quotes from Gustav Landauer, who's standing at the funeral and speaks about Kurt Eisner, the prophet, the Jew. But the real problem I think we can talk about later is that this doesn't happen in other revolutions, although the Jewish community in Munich fundamentally was not very happy about the fact that these were Jews operating there.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, I of course deliberately choose a maybe unusual beginning for a German revolution and for the rise of Nazism by starting every chapter with the Jewish holiday. And of course, I start with Hanukkah because the revolution started in late 1918, and Hanukkah actually was quite late in 1918. and the Jews of Munich were celebrating Hanukkah in interesting times. It was the first time in Germany that a German Jew, Kurt Eisner, was the prime minister of a German state. He founded what's still called until today the Free State of Bavaria. I should say he was the first, and he was basically almost the last ever until today head of a German state. And he only lasted 3 months until he was assassinated in February of 1919. I want to say a word about the revolution itself. For background, as background to those, of course, who are not so familiar with the historical background. The Bavarian king, who came from the famous House of Wittelsbach, which was ruling Bavaria for over 700 years, was overthrown on November 7th, 1918. And that was actually the first monarch in Germany who lost his job, so to say, 2 days before the Kaiser, the emperor, had to leave Berlin. And it was a totally bloodless revolution. And in that respect, Kurt Eisner, who called the Free State, which was no longer monarchy, of Bavaria in November of 1918, was actually seemed to be quite popular in that moment. There was no resistance. The soldiers flocked to him out of the barracks. The peasants from around Munich in this conservative Bavaria, they all seemed very much fed up with the monarchy, with the loss of the war, with the economic circumstances. Now that changed, and Eisner, who was a relatively moderate socialist, He was a longtime member of the Social Democratic Party, and then during World War I, when he became a pacifist, he was one of those who founded an independent Social Democratic Party to stop the war, but he was never a radical. And we see this when he became prime minister in November of 1918. He actually employed many servants, they just stayed on. And what was interesting is that he, even though he was basically appointed by the so-called councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants, he did not abandon the idea of a parliamentary democracy, and he called for elections. And he got his elections in late January of 1919. He lost them, terribly lost them. His own party got 2.5%. And when he, in February of 1919, was on his way to the Bavarian parliament with his letter of resignation in his pocket, he was shot by a young Count Anton von Arco. Now, here's another Jewish element. Anton von Arco's mother was a née von Oppenheim, coming from an old Jewish family, although they were converted and were Protestants already. But Anton von Arco, this 20-year-old right-wing nationalist, was not accepted by the right-wing association, the Thule association he wanted to join, because of his partially non-Aryan background. So another interesting element for Jewish history. And if I may just end this with maybe two quotes actually from the book. What made it so particular, so remarkable, not only for German history, but for Jewish history as well, is I start the book by talking about the funeral of Kurt Eisner, which was the largest funeral Munich had ever seen. And it happened in February of 1919. A crowd of 100,000 assembled at Munich's Ostfriedhof. And the main speaker was the closest associate of Kurt Eisner, another German Jew, very, very much involved actually in discussing Jewish issues publicly and also being very sympathetic towards the Zionist cause. And that was Gustav Landauer. So Gustav Landauer gave this speech on February 26th of 1919. And in this speech, what does he say? And I quote from his speech. He says, Kurt Eisner, the Jew, was a prophet because he sympathized with the poor and downtrodden and saw the opportunity and the necessity of putting an end to poverty and subjugation. So Kurt Eisner, the Jew, that was the word, these were the words Landauer used, another German Jew used at the funeral. And in fact, Landauer was a very close friend of the philosopher Martin Buber, probably the best known German Jewish philosopher of the 20th century. Buber actually had come to visit Landauer in Munich to see what is going on in that revolution. And he came in February of 1919, and he left the day Eisner was murdered. And what does he write? He writes to his friend the next day. And I'm not quoting here much, just one sentence. He says, the whole thing, an unspeakable Jewish tragedy. And he says that in February of 1919, when the Jewish tragedy only starts to unfold. In fact, one last thing, in December of 1918, briefly after the revolution had started, Landauer urged Buber to write about exactly these aspects. And he writes to Buber, Dear Buber, a very fine theme, the revolution and the Jews. Make sure to treat the leading part the Jews have played in the upheaval. And I found these quotes are quite remarkable. Of course, Buber didn't write the story of the Jews in the revolution, neither did anyone else besides the anti-Semites. They loved this, of course. So Hitler was one of those who made a big story out of the involvement of many Jews. But it's interesting that Landauer had urged Buber to write about it.
Okay, let's first of all, perhaps I can bring to light why I think your work is of particular value. And that is to say, there is in your work no hint of apology. Yaakov Talmon, the Israeli historian, a long time ago, wrote that the problem of Jews and revolution in general is like an orphan, a waif, a foundling. No one really wants to touch it. The Jews certainly don't want to touch it because, as we all know, after these events, the whole myth of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy becomes extremely powerful. And so Jews would want to get as far away as possible from revolution. And most Jewish, or as Gershom Scholem said in one way, Jewish historiography generally, until fairly recently, has been apologetic. You don't want to talk about the thieves, you don't want to talk about the robbers, you don't want to talk about the underworld. And I think the same has been true of Jewish revolutionaries. What you have done here is said, well, wait, most apologists have said, oh yes, there were Jews in revolutions, but they weren't anymore identified as revolutionaries, or as Jews, excuse me. They all disaffiliated. So you have, of course, Isaac Deutsch's famous word, non-Jewish Jews. These were Jews who left Judaism behind, who disaffected, just left it, so they can't be considered Jews. Well, on an empirical level, what you do is you demonstrate very clearly that Landauer, Eisner, Toller, Erich Musam, and a few others all recognized their Jewishness, did not escape it, and as you said, Landauer is even saying, stress it. So the first thing I'm saying historiographically, you have brought a non-apologetic aspect of Jews and revolution to the fore. The second point that I would make here, in terms of the tragedy, of course, is the fact that not only Eisner, but also Landauer is killed. Musam escapes with his life and is imprisoned. But the reaction to the revolution does come pretty violently. And I'd like you to speak now, here's your chance, about both the rise of hotbed of right-wing reaction to what's going on, but as importantly, give us a map of how the Jewish community itself responded to these revolutionaries.
Yes, thanks. I will start with the latter. And I totally agree. And you brought already in all the names I didn't even mention. Many of those Jewish leaders of the revolution, which started with Eisner and then went into a second phase in the so-called Council of Räterepublik, some people call it Soviet Republic. I use the term Council Republic in April of 1919. There were German Jewish writers like Erich Mühsam, Ernst Toller, and of course Gustav Landauer played again a role. And it is really interesting. I'm just commenting on what you said. Very different from a Trotsky in Moscow or Rosa Luxemburg or Petersburg and a Rosa Luxemburg in Berlin. They were not ashamed of their Jewishness. And you mentioned, we talked about the Jewish holidays. So one of the poems Erich Mühsam wrote, it wasn't during the revolution when he wrote it, but nevertheless, I thought it's so ingenious. And it was, and I just want to read one verse of it, translated, by the way, not by me, but by my wonderful translator, Jeremiah Riemer. And it reads as follows, and it's about Christmas. And I will skip the first verse. Minister and agrarian, bourgeois and proletarian, they all rejoice, each Aryan, at this time and wherever they are able, the birth of Christ in that cow stable. Except the people for whom this was fate, it's Hanukkah they'd rather celebrate. Or the last line in German, das Volk allein dem es geschah, das feiert lieber Hanukkah. And I think that was just very telling for his very self-confident use of Jewish tropes, in many things he published. So your question about the reaction of the Jews, especially in Munich. They were, I would say, besides the anti-Semites, nobody hated the Jewish revolutionaries more than most Munich Jews, because they were scared. They had seen already what happened in Russia. And there was the saying, the Trotskys make the revolution and the Bronsteins have to pay the price for it. And I think the German Jews knew the same. One example, there was the leader of the Orthodox Jewish congregation in Munich, a very well-known middle-class Munich gentleman by the name of Sigmund Frankl. And Frankl he went actually to the Munich newspaper with a letter which he wanted them to publish, and they did publish it later, in which he writes the following, and I'm just reading a few of the lines. So this is the leader of the Jewish Orthodox community. My Jewish sense of solidarity admonishes me to make you aware of all this in your own interest. I am further admonished by an inner voice to protect my community of faith from the odium that traditional Judaism has anything to do with the destructive tendencies of ambitious revolutionary politicians. And then he says, Bavaria indigenous Jewry, which of course he and his family was, shouts out by way of me to Bavaria's population, our hands are clean of the horrors of chaos and of the misery and suffering that your politics, and he addresses it to the Jewish revolutionaries by name, that your politics must need conjure up over Bavaria's future development. You alone and only you bear full responsibility for this. So he says, you're not part of our community. We distance ourselves from you and we're not responsible for you. Now, here's an interesting footnote, which I mean, I had known the letter before, but what I found during my research was that Erich Mühsam, the anarchist, coffee house writer and revolutionary who was part of all phases of the revolution and was arrested after the revolution was oppressed, he actually responded to this letter. He responded from his prison cell. And he says the following. He doesn't distance himself as a Jew, but they fight about who has the real good interpretation of what's Jewish. So he responds to the Orthodox Jew, the bourgeois Frankl. And he says, I am a Jew and will remain a Jew for as long as I live. I've never denied my Judaism and have not even left the religious Jewish community. That I'm a Jew is something I view neither as an advantage or as a defect. It is simply part of my essence, like my red beard, my bodily weight, or my inclinations and interests. And then he actually wants to say our Judaism, our revolutionaries' feel of Judaism is better than that of this bourgeois Jewish merchant. And he says, you can see how anti-Semitism, even without us 5 Jews that you have fished out of 10,000, finds enough material in order to ply its murky dealings. I am of the view that it does bring more honor to Judaism like Rosa Luxemburg, Gustav Landauer, or Eugen Leviné. These are Jewish socialist communist revolutionaries. Then when the anti-Semites, busy collecting materials, have to connect their denunciation to Jewish usurers and racketeers, and he means Frankel. This was what I would have had the defender of Judaism say against his degenerate sons, he said ironically about himself. So here you see, and I find this fascinating, they both, the socialist anarchist Jew, Mühsam, is fighting with the Orthodox bourgeois Jew, Frankel, who has the better understanding of what the prophets wanted, what the Bible wants, and so on. But of course, he says something interesting here as well, which leads to your second question. And that is, it didn't need as 5, and maybe it was 12 and not 5, Jewish revolutionaries in order to create the anti-Semitism we're experiencing. And I'm very careful in my book to not make a clear, not draw a clear conclusion saying because of those revolutionaries, therefore we have this wave of anti-Semitism. And that's the second part of my book, is really to show how Munich, well, let's say this, I actually only wanted to write about the Jewish revolutionaries until I saw that there still has to be written the real story of how Munich became the capital of anti-Semitism. In a way, the training ground for Hitler for trying out what he would later practice once he became, Reichskanzler, the Chancellor of Germany 10 years later. But in the early 20s, he used Munich as a scene to try out how far could we go with our anti-Semitic rhetoric and then actions. And he didn't even need to act first because it was the conservative government, which was not Nazi, was not pro-Hitler, the conservative government in Bavaria in the early 1920s that initiated drastic anti-Semitic measures. For example, they tried to expel East European Jews twice, and we have anti-Semitic officers in place in the police, basically the head of the police. Of course, as we know, the judges were right-wing very often. And so we see a situation in the early 1920s where even American diplomats became very alert to what is going on here in Munich. It's not Berlin, it's not Frankfurt, it's really Munich, and that's where Hitler sees a good possibility to start his movement and use Munich as a testing ground.
Yeah, I've no doubt about the anti-Semitism that developed, and it would probably have developed without the revolutionaries. But the revolutionaries, and by the way, we haven't mentioned something which we take for granted. The 3 revolutions that occurred very close to each other were all failures. They did not succeed. And that's crucial to remark. Nevertheless, I would argue that one of the central pillars in the development, the special development of anti-Semitism in Munich, were the revolutions and was the Jewish role. You mentioned the police, the judiciary, all kinds of civil society. But what's perhaps even more interesting is, as you point out, Pacelli, who was the papal nuncio and who later became the Pope, is speaking at the same time about a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. Thomas Mann, who is later seen as this great Democrat, is saying with regard to these Jewish radicals that the most powerful martial law needs to be exposed and put onto these kinds of people. So I think that the role of Jewish revolutionaries here is certainly part and parcel of what is developing there. Certainly not alone, but I think it is a fundamental part of the story.
Yes, absolutely, and I'm grateful you mentioned the Catholic Church, because I mean, you know, you could say Munich was, why not Berlin? Why not other places? It just happened so that quite a lot of fascinating, unique players were in Munich at the time. At least some of the players who became important later. The papal nuncios, as you mentioned, Pacelli, became later Pope Pius. And it is interesting to see his correspondence during the events of 1918-19, where he makes pretty anti-Semitic remarks. I would say remarks especially directed against East European Jews. And that is an interesting element. And of course, you, Steve, I mean, you wrote pioneering work about East European Jews in Germany. It is really fascinating to see how all these German Jews, including Kurt Eisner, who was born in Berlin, were turned into Eastern Europeans by not just the radical anti-Semites, but Pacelli, or the first Archbishop, later Cardinal Faulhaber, maybe the most influential figure in Catholic Munich, and many others. They either willingly, or maybe because they actually believed it, turned Eisner into a Galician Jew. They gave him names, Kosmanowski and Salomon is the first name. Actually, he made even fun of it in one of the cabinet meetings. He said, I have to talk about the fact that they give me this beautiful name, Salomon. Unfortunately, my name is Kurt. It's a much more beautiful name, he says. But it was not much fun for him. I went to the archives, the Eisner archives in Berlin. It's a big estate, and there are two big folders with hundreds of anti-Semitic letters written in the 3 months he was in office, with drawings showing him on a gallows or shot. I mean, pretty brutal language and imagery. And by the way, the fact that he was just made into Ostjud, an East European Jew, continued after World War II. There were some respected historians in the 50s who still believed that and used it. And well, he was not a Bavarian, that is true. He was born in Berlin, but he was at least as German as many of the emerging Nazis in Munich at the time, who were mostly also from somewhere else, including Hitler, who came, of course, from Austria.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I'm looking at the watch, so what I want to do now, if you are permitting me, is I want to broaden the discussion, because at the same time as in Munich, Jewish revolutionaries are busy in Berlin, they are busy in Hungary, and they are busy above all in Russia. So what you have done is, I think, added a very significant historiographical contribution to the general problem of Jews and revolution. But I think what I'd like you to address, and perhaps give me a moment to just speak about this, is a question which a very respected man who I really respected and liked, Walter Laqueur, has raised. And Walter Laqueur wrote the following about the German situation, and I assume not just Berlin, but also Munich. And certainly it could be applied elsewhere. And where he wrote the following: These Jewish radicals were quite oblivious to one basic existential fact, that they were living in an intellectual ghetto, that the great majority of Germans did not just dislike them, but disputed their very right to have a voice as far as the future of Germany was concerned. Nor did it matter that most of them had no longer any tie with the Jewish community. So what Lacour is asking here is, and I will make another distinction. When it comes to the Russian Revolution and the role of Jews afterwards, there were some very terrible Jews, and I'll come to that. Some shocking actions. The Eisners, the Tollers, the Landaus, the Musams were idealists, were good socialists, were not violent, and they are to be very much respected. But nevertheless, they became lumped within this whole threat called Judeo-Bolshevism. So I would argue that he is not wrong about saying they really had a slightly skewed view of reality, but their sin, unlike the Russian revolutionaries, was not murder and terror, but naivete.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say none of them, with the exception of Eisner, but none of the others, including Mühsam, Toller, Landauer, were able politicians, and they really didn't know for the most what they were doing. I think they had good intentions. And there were also others, also other Jews in that revolution in the latest phase, which was the Second Council Republic, which was in fact not bloodless, there was more violence there, was led by a person called Eugen Leviné, who was Russian-born and who was a communist and who had very different ideas from the others. And in fact, there were lots of fights, of course, going on also between the Jewish revolutionaries, Toller and Leviné and so on. Ironically, by the way, Leviné, who was one of the very few people ever executed in the Weimar Republic, by the way, he was executed in June of 1919 in Munich. He had a Jewish funeral in Munich at the Jewish cemetery with the rabbi, who was actually a monarchist, having to say some kind of, brachot, some kind of a ceremony that took place. And therefore, every year, at the day of his yahrzeit, so to say, the Communist Party of Germany tried to make a demonstration on the Jewish cemetery of Munich, and the Jewish community didn't really know, well, they had to let them in, but then the police also was against it. So they were always in the middle. But you also had those different kinds of revolutionaries there as well. And what I also tried to show is, of course, there were not only Jews on the sides of the revolution, but also quite a few Jewish leaders on the sides of those who tried to suppress the revolution, fight against the revolution as well. But I agree with what you said initially, and I also hold Walter Lacour in very high esteem. But I think Munich can be, in a way, an example for the complexity and diversity of this issue. Now, the question, of course, why do you have so many Jews at this time, and of all places in Munich? Well, I mean, it was impossible for Jews, as you know, to become political leaders before 1918. There were many able Jewish politicians. Some of them were members of the German parliament, of the Reichstag, but they couldn't become a government minister, not to think even of a prime minister. So that suddenly opened up, and it wasn't the conservative parties who would allow Jews to rise on top. So while the vast majority of Jews would not vote for the socialists, the majority of the active Jewish politicians happened to be socialists. For this minute, I mean, later in in the Weimar Republic, you have the most famous, the one famous German Jewish politician was Walter Rathenau, who was not a socialist.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But so we can ask the question, because we leave Munich now and put it into a larger scale, where the old question is, why did so many Jews become revolutionaries? And the answers vary very much. One of them would be quite simply, prior to this, they were unable to exercise any political power or activity. B, they were the downtrodden and the depressed. Some idealist historians, George Mosse, for instance, is one, Yaakov Talmon is another, who said this is part of the messianic Jewish ideal of social justice, and therefore they became revolutionaries. So this all may be true, but if I'm looking at the time, I want to raise an issue with you and see where we go with this. I mean, if we take the Russian Empire, 150 million people, only 5% were Jews, but they constituted about 50% of the membership of revolutionary parties. There were 7 original members of the political bureau who were Jews, not including Lenin himself, who was himself half Jewish. During the Civil War, some were involved in absolutely violent terrorist activities. Let me just give one example. Lazar Kaganovich, first deputy premier of the Soviet Union, who was complicit in the Great Purge and responsible for thousands of deaths, and who was, and this has to do with our present situation, very much responsible for the famine in Ukraine, which had disastrous consequences. I won't go on, but in Hungary, you had the head of the secret police, who was Jewish. Bela Kun, who was Bela Kon, was head of that revolution. And so I'm going to ask you a question, which I have an answer, but I'd love to hear your answer first. How do we assess the Jews and their actions in these revolutions? Do we have an assessment? How would you, in the end, come down and say, well, Jews, put it this way, I'll start with one answer and then see where you go. It's the answer which one man recently said, well, these, and this isn't true for Munich, that's why your work is so important, because you show they were Jews. But for the others, one argument is, well, they weren't any more Jews. They didn't act as Jews. They left their community. They were no longer Jewish. And as an Israeli historian, Shmuel Ettinger, put it this way, what was Jewish in them? They were born to Jewish mothers, and I, not being a racist, don't see anything to it. They were not culturally or religiously Jewish. Are we to say that if a Jew, an individual Jew, is a criminal, does that mean that all Jews are responsible for his or her actions? So one assessment would be a denial of their Jewishness or the relevance of their Jewishness. Yeah. How would you read this?
Yeah, very important point. You know, that was kind of my reason to write the book, because you can't deny, they didn't deny their own Jewishness. You can do it with the Trotsky, you can do it with the Rosa Luxemburg, you can also do it with maybe an Eugen Leviné, who was part of the Munich last part of the revolution, but not with Mühsam and Landauer, and probably not with Eisner either. Well, yes, it wasn't their most important. I mean, if they would list as, you know, but like Mühsam said, it's part of me, like my red beard. It's part of me. And I think, and Landauer even more. I mean, he went to Zionist, he spoke to Zionist meetings, and he published in Martin Buber's, and they were close friends and so on. but he was not a revolutionary as a Jew. So in a way, yes, the leaders of that Bavarian revolutions happened to be Jewish, but it wasn't the Jewish revolution. And I think it's very important to distinguish. And I would just answer by saying, you can't generalize just, if they all happen to be Protestants in Catholic Bavaria, you wouldn't say it's a Protestant conspiracy or a Protestant revolution. There are reasons why there are a lot of Jewish revolutionaries in this moment of history in Russia, in Hungary, in Munich. They have to do a lot of things. And one thing maybe we didn't mention is that the socialist movement was very much a class movement at the time. Most of them were proletarians or workers, and there weren't that many more intellectuals, and Jews were very much overrepresented among the intellectuals in the socialist movement. That's just one of several reasons. But of course, and now I'm again coming to the large second part of the book, it didn't matter to the anti-Semites. Did it matter to them if a Landauer, wrote about what it meant to be Jewish, or if a Leviné didn't care about him being Jewish? No, it didn't matter to them. They even made, of course, those two Jews who only had Jewish-sounding names. There was actually one revolutionary who was not Jewish among the leaders, whose name was Levin. Now, he was, it seems, pure Aryan in quotation marks. So they, of course, made him also to a Jew. It didn't matter. I would say this is a question which really can only be answered as really looking at the individual time and place and persons. Of course, for the enemies of the Jews, that didn't matter. That never mattered. And Munich, again, is an excellent example of seeing this, how to have such they probably would have been anti-Semites without that. But it gave them just such an amazing foil, such an amazing, reason to say, look, Bolsheviks and Jews, now we have the two most terrible things you can imagine together.
Yes, absolutely agree that in terms of the anti-Semites, you're going to have the anti-Semitism anyway. But perhaps I'll turn now to a friend of mine, Jonathan Frankel, who was a very distinguished Russian historian, who didn't have your luxury. Your luxury was these were Jews who not only admitted that they were Jews, but who were humanists and were not interested in violent revolution and in bloody war. He was more interested, I think, in those very problematic Jewish revolutionaries. And he said, okay, then what should our attitude be to these kinds of revolutions? So I'm going to quote to you now two people on both sides, one side and then the other. A man called Gary Mawson puts it this way: I cannot count the number of times I heard that of the four great thinkers shaping the modern world, Marx, Darwin, Freud, and Einstein, three were Jews. If Jews can claim honor and honor for themselves for Marx, Freud, and Einstein, how on earth can they avoid responsibility for Trotsky? But what does Mawson say? Mawson argues, yes, they do not hold any responsibility or feeling of identification because all of these terrible revolutionaries stopped acting as Jews, which is not the case for you in Munich. But then Jonathan Frankel says the following, and I'm interested in your answer, and I will preface it by saying what your book does is you finally bring out the problem without any hint of apologetics and without pride or shame. simply bring out that act as it occurred. Jonathan writes the following. The Jewish people cannot simply shrug off the Trotskys, the Uritskys, and the Yagodas as non-Jewish. If Jews take pride in Heinrich Heine, Felix Mendelssohn, Benjamin Disraeli, and Boris Pasternak, who were Jews by birth, but were baptized into the Christian faith, can it be logical, as distinct from comfortable, to disown the non-Jewish Jews who participated in destroying Russia's democracy in 1917, in establishing a brutal dictatorship, and in provoking a ferocious civil war across the length and breadth of the country? And then he answers it in the following way. He said, of course, this couldn't possibly involve us as Jews today, sharing in their guilt. That's not the question. However, he says, the question of collective shame is another matter entirely. Insofar as members of a nation or an ethnic group regard themselves as, in some sense, as members of a family-type collectivity, nothing is more instinctive than for them to feel pride in its heroes and shame with respect to its criminals, be it of the everyday or the political variety. He concludes, regardless how much the non-Jewish Jews dissociated from the Jewish people, and however much the Jewish people might prefer to disown them, the fact is that in historical and sociological terms, we cannot justify excluding them. Now, I will end by saying this is not your problem. What I found so valuable in your work is bringing out the Jewishness, showing it without the murderous consequences of the Russian Revolution. And I know of no other historiography that brings neither pride nor shame to the study of Jews and revolutionaries. And I think that's the lasting value of your work. I'm not necessarily asking you to agree with Jonathan's ideas, but I think that's where the bulk of your participation is so valuable.
Thank you. Thank you. I may just leave it at that. I think as a historian, we have to, and I remember really, I mentioned Michael Gretz before. He taught, I think it was my first year of studies, he taught a class on Jewish revolutionaries. And he made this point, if we like them or don't like them, but if we deal with Jewish history, we cannot exclude them. And that's, I think, where I go. I don't speak about, you're right, about pride or shame. I don't think that's the categories I would use as a historian, but we should not exclude them. And if they took a position on their Jewish background, then we should at least see what it was. And it was very different for Rosa Luxemburg, who kind of distanced herself, and let's say Erich Mühsam. Anyway, I see Irene.
Yes, I followed your very interesting conversation. Yeah, I just had one person in mind who was close with Landauer for a short while. That was Konstantin Brunner, on a completely different side of the land card. And he, we saw in the Weimar Republic finally the possibility of a state of law and order, which would give the Jews, a secure place. And for him, when he heard that Landauer died, he said, right. So he was so strict against all these revolutionaries because they endangered from his position what they could do to the Jewish community in Germany. We received a couple of questions, and I just go quickly over them. Timothy Hyman is asking if you are relating in your book to the case of Red Maroon. He's also the writer called B. Traven, who produced the anarchist magazine Der Ziegelbrenner from 1917. Does it sound familiar to you, Michael? He was a friend of Landauer and Mühsam and sentenced to death on May 1st.
Yes, I did not really deal with Traven in my book. It's familiar, and unfortunately, that was not part of my book. But may I just relate 1 second to Konstantin Brunner, because he and Landauer were friends, and they exchanged letters about Jewish issues as well. And one of them, he actually, Landauer wrote to Brunner, he said, "I have not the slightest disposition to forget, even for a day, the joy I take in my Judaism." That's Landauer, the revolutionary, writing to Brunner. So another example, yeah.
Right. Paula Rosenfeld is asking, if you describe the events of 1918-19 as bloodless, why do you refer to it as a revolution instead of a regime change?
Good question. I mean, there is a whole discussion of what constitutes a revolution, what not. I don't know if a revolution has to be bloody. Most of the revolutions we know are bloody. In fact, that one became, as I said, in the later phase, also not totally bloodless. And in fact, the way it was oppressed and turned into a reactionary phase was very bloody. And Landauer was murdered in a terrible, terrible way. And he was a pacifist. But no, I think even the revolutionaries themselves, now I call them revolutionaries, they used the word revolution. Everybody used the word revolution in November of 1918, with or without bloodshed. But it was clear it was a turning around, and that's what a revolution is, of a political regime. But if you want to call it regime change, I have no problem with it. It was not like, you know, it was a radical regime change, of course.
Then we have Peter Ranis, who is asking if you think that the autonomy of federalism in the Weimar Republic helped in the cause of Nazism, and if Weimar would have been more centralized unity system, if the outcome might have been different.
Well, that's a question very, not really so much related to my book. And I think one could give a whole different lecture about it. Maybe I really can't answer this in 1 or 2 sentences. Yeah, but it's a good question, but it's a different topic.
Okay. And you also asked if you know if there were many Jews in the Spartacus movement apart from Luxembourg and Liebknecht.
But there were a few, and later in the Communist Party. One of them, the prominent ones in the early 1920s, was Gershom Scholem's brother, Werner Scholem, who was a member of the Communist Party in the German parliament, the Reichstag. And of course, for those who are not familiar, Gershom Scholem then became the most important, I would say, scholar of Jewish studies and founder of the research of Jewish mysticism and professor at the Hebrew University. And his brother Werner was the much more famous Scholem in the 1920s.
Just let me add that Werner Scholem, unlike Rosa Luxemburg and Leo Eurichis, did accept his Jewishness, and even in prison thought about should he give his children a Jewish education. So he does fit into that model more than the Rosa Luxemburg kind.
And Shmuel Yerushalmi is asking, what, according to you, your role in the rise of Nazism in Germany conflicts between German communist and social democratic movements? Is it the internal conflicts within the social movement of Germany that played the crucial role in the rise of power of Nazism?
I'm sorry, I have, what according to you, role of the rise of Nazism in German conflict? I'm trying to understand the question, sorry. So the question is probably if the fight between communists and social democrats contributed to the rise of Nazism. I understand it. Well, it didn't help to stabilize the democracy, that is certainly right. The infighting on the left. It is interesting, though, and again, this is different from Russia, if we stay in the role of Jewish socialists, that you find them more on the moderate side and not on the radical side in Germany. And Scholem is a good example. And in fact, he was expelled and also left the Communist Party because he was not a Stalinist and he was not going along with the, I would say, radicalization, as he saw it, of German communism. And you also see it within the Social Democrats. I mean, it's interesting, different from Russia. I think Jewish Social Democrats and socialists and communists in Germany were not as, maybe they also were more afraid, and that's just a thesis I'm just speculating on right now, of the rise of the radical right and Nazism by splitting the movement. But again, this is speculation. We'll never have a definite answer to that.
You mentioned that to some extent, but Mitch Gerber wants to know what was the reaction of the German Jewish community, particularly the intellectuals and those who considered themselves primarily of German identity, to the revolutionaries.
Yes. Yeah, so this is a big part of my book, actually. And I think of course, there has been so much written on the rise of the Nazi movement in Munich and Hitler. So yes, I don't claim to give something new to that part. But I think which has not been looked at so much is what was the reaction of the German Jewish community, and how did they also deal with the rise of anti-Semitism in Munich? And not only Munich Jews, but Jews in Germany and in fact all over the world. And their reaction, as I said before, was pretty clear. They did not like the fact. I start the book with Hanukkah of 1918. So you have a Jewish prime minister now. Were they happy about it? Was it like a Hanukkah miracle for them? No, they were scared. A Jewish prime minister, that could only be rishis, as they would say. That could cause anti-Semitism. Of course, they were right. The same, by the way, happened not with the socialist or revolutionary, but when Walter Rathenau became foreign minister in 1922, it was Albert Einstein and the leader of the German Zionist movement, Kurt Blumenfeld, who went to Einstein's house. It was late at night to basically talk him out of accepting the offer to become foreign minister. And they argued that Germany is not ready for a Jewish foreign minister. Well, he did not listen to them, of course not. And he opted out, and he became foreign minister, and he was assassinated less than half a year later. I should add, to the person who asked this, among the most interesting finds in this collection of anti-Semitic letters to Eisner, there are also letters written by Bavarian Jews who write to him concerned, say, as a Jew, even if we like you, you shouldn't become prime minister. It will expose us to negative reactions. And interestingly, he even answered, there's some letters where I don't know how he had the time to do all that in the 3 months he was prime minister, and by the way, foreign minister of Bavaria. He did answer a few of them. And he said, like, one was a pretty long letter. And he said, well, his answer was basically, if I would listen to you, what would I do here? I am acting here as a Bavarian politician, not as a Jew. Nobody cares, and he knew better. Nobody cares what my religious background is. Well, people did care, of course, but of course he gave the only answer he could give as a German politician. He said that's not relevant.
And I think it's no surprise that there were so many adaptations actually of Yud Süß in the Weimar Republic after Rathenau's death. The same picture of a Jew that made too much of success, which is actually not acceptable to some extent. Following your Jewish holidays, Hanukkah, etc., someone is asking, did these Jewish revolutionaries actually observe Judaism to some degree?
No, they did not. They did not observe religion. So I start with Hanukkah, and of course, they did not celebrate Hanukkah or any other Jewish holiday. Some of them, not like the most important ones, some of them came from religious or even Orthodox families, like Kurt Eisner's very closest, basically his secretary, by the name of Felix Feschenbach. he came from an Orthodox German Jewish family, but none of them, they were socialists after all. They did not observe religious rituals or holidays, but they knew about them. And you see it like Erich Mühsam in this, I think only a Jewish author could have written such a poem. So they were aware of it. They thought, some of them, as you said before, Steve, that they acted according to the ideals of the biblical prophets in the spirit of Judaism, but a secularized Judaism, of course. And just for the holidays, what I also found fascinating as an archival find, I end the book with Hitler's failed beer hall putsch, 1923. And if you look at the events in November 8th of Munich of 1923, they read a little bit, almost like 15 years later, November 8th and 9th of 1938. Already, when Hitler tried to come to power in 1923, he targeted Jews and socialists, by the way. SA men went into the houses of some of the wealthy Jews, abducted some. There's a story that the rabbi of Munich was bound to a tree and threatened to be killed, and so on. It was pretty rough stories. And since the beer hall putsch failed and Hitler did not come to power, the Orthodox congregation in Munich established a special Purim holiday, as was tradition for centuries in Jewish ritual. When you were saved from an immediate threat and danger, there were local Purims established. So the Jewish community of Munich, that was totally new to me, and nobody in Munich I spoke to ever heard of that, established a Purim, which was supposed to be celebrated for 10 years. And I thought that's kind of the irony. When was the last time it was supposed to be celebrated when they were kind of saved from it? From 1923, it was 1933. And that was, of course, when Hitler was in power.
You're receiving regards from Keith Iquist. Thanks for your conversation. He's happy to see both of you after so many years. And I'm closing with the last question of Gautam Chakrabarti, and he's asking, someone deeply interested in the relationship between the immense Jewish agency and the Moderne and the awe-inspiring geographical spread, thinking Auerbach, Zweig, Taut et al. On the Jewish intellect. I was wondering how to relate this to the Jewish role in world revolutions.
Ooh, it's a big question. I don't really think, again, that I'm able to just give a brief answer to that. And I don't know how it's collected, honestly, but I would have to think more about it.
Okay, so Gautam, you can get directly in contact with Professor Brenner if you want. A last little technical question, Michael, do you know if there will be an ebook of the book?
That's a good question. I think there might be one, actually. I mean, if you look at the website of Princeton University Press, I know there is an audiobook.
Okay.
But I think there might also be an ebook. That's a good question, which I should check, but it's easy to check on Princeton University Press or Amazon or one of those pages.
Okay. So thank you all very much. You, Michael, for the book, and Stephen for the conversation, the discussion, and all our participants. I actually don't want to close the evening before one last sentence, because I know tomorrow it's a very special day for Siva Shaim. It's a very special birthday, and I just want to send all our best wishes and regards, and happy birthday tomorrow, Steve.
Thank you very much, but you shouldn't mention something like that. When you reach my age, this is unmentioned.
I didn't mean your age. I just said happy birthday.
Many, many thanks.
Okay.
Well, thank you both, and happy birthday, Steve.
Good night or good day. Bye-bye.